right. Hello and welcome to the course on strategy work and our lecture on business environment. My name is Kohtamäki and I'm teaching the course and lecturing, giving you a short lecture on business environment. I'm a professor in School of Management and Strategic Business Development program. So this lecture is about macro environment, so-called business environment. We try to go through some basic concepts and scenarios as a tool to understand how the business environment is and how scenarios can be, as a tool, can be used to understand the business environment. So we need to understand the business environment as an important phenomenon that is influencing on our firm's strategy and resources. So the changes in the macro environment generate needs to adapt our company strategy, and hence we need concepts and tools to understand the business environment. And scenarios is one tool that can help us to understand and foresee and describe different types of possible futures, to understand the varieties of possibilities that may exist. Scenarios describe what's happening in the business environment, in the broader society, and describe generically different futures rather than variation in or regarding only one particular variable like technology, digitalization, or some other specific technology. So combinations of different variables, typologies. Identification of relevant factors for change. So scenarios is about identifying varieties of relevant factors and then grouping those variables to understand what types of typologies can exist, what types of different and what scenarios can exist. And it's a tool, scenarios is a tool to feed data for strategic decision making. So typically the business environment it's first of all a broad concept. We need concepts and we need ways to understand how the business environment changes, how it varies. And for instance, dynamism and complexity provide these types of concepts which we can use to separate the simple and stable business environment from complex and unstable, the equilibrium condition from the disequilibrium condition. As an example, this figure illustrates the requirement of strategic fit between the business environment, strategy, and organization when the organizational dimension is defined as a dimension of a value system organization where the firm's own organization takes place. So the business environment is described by using three different variables: stable versus dynamic business environment, simple versus complex business environment, hostile versus friendly business environment. Friendly here referring to an environment where there is less competition. And then strategy. Again, we are using here as an example, three basic dimensions of strategy and innovation strategy variables: standard products versus customized products, low cost from differentiation, like Michael Porter defined 2080 competitive advantage book. And then the in typical innovation variable, the follower strategy versus technology innovation leader strategy. So that whether the company is a technology follower or a technology leader. And then for the organization of the value system, the markets versus the hierarchies from the Oliver Williamson's transaction cost theory, and in between a hybrid form of organization, the so-called network form. As an example from car industry, for instance, if you consider Koenigsegg as a car manufacturer producing, let's say, 50 customized sports cars per year, you have, as a Koenigsegg, in contrast to some large, really large manufacturer, let's say Volkswagen, for instance. Koenigsegg produces 50 customized sports cars per year, with very differentiated product strategy, um, in some respects perhaps being at least in the technological edge, if not a technology leader, even a top technology leader in some specific um, product technologies, or perhaps product design, for instance. With this strategy, Volkswagen, Koenigsegg differentiates itself from mass car manufacturers, but at the same time decides to operate in a business environment where customer needs are constantly changing. They are making really expensive, customized, top tier, high quality products, which means that their customers are extremely demanding, which means that they constantly have to develop, um, of course, products that are at the edge of technological development, innovation, also consumer experience, which means that they are deciding that their business and they are operating in a business environment which is highly dynamic and complex, which also means perhaps that it may not be as competitive or hostile as standard product business environments. But in this type of environment, with this type of strategy, they have decided that 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 this is their strategic orientation, and this is how they should be organizing their value system, their supply system, um, which basically means that if they outsource significant parts of customization, customized systems manufacturing, for instance, it means a lot of transaction costs because many of the systems are customized and constantly changing, meaning that outsourcing large parts of manufacturing, particularly in terms of those components and subsystems, which are often changing, would be costly because of the transaction costs. So it means that if they would be outsourcing systems in that sort of landscape, they would be generating large chunks of transaction costs, which would be eating away their productivity. and this would suggest that particularly in terms of those components where the changes are constant, if they have the technological edge, they can manufacture those by themselves. But that, of course, would require that they have the capability of manufacturing those types of components by themselves. In contrast, if the car manufacturer would be making standard products with low-cost strategy using follower innovation technology strategy, they would have decided of operating in a stable, simple, and more hostile business environment, which would mean that they would need to use low-cost strategy also when they are operating in their market operations and in their supply governance. So this perhaps would mean that they would be outsourcing the simple component and subsystem manufacturing and then intending to use market mechanism, competitive bidding to push component prices down as hard as possible. So these are just two very simplistic, overly simplified examples of the fit between environment strategy and an organizational value system structure. As you noticed, I'm not talking about only the firm within firm organizational structure, but actually the value system, supply system structure, which should be adapting to the strategy and business environment. So this is an example, simplistic example of the strategic fit between environment strategy and structure. To continue giving the basic concepts in terms of business environment, why these concepts are important. They're important so that we have words, concepts, which we can use to understand and separate different business environments so that we can understand how the business environments vary. So starting from down, we have from dynamism, we have environmental dynamism as a multidimensional construct, which actually intends to measure the speed of environmental change, so-called environmental velocity, unpredictability, and speed of change in the business environment. So dynamism is an important variable. Second variable, we have the hostility. Hostile environments being characterized by competitive intensity, paucity of readily exploitable market opportunities, tremendous competitive market, product-related uncertainties, and vulnerability to influence from forces and elements external to the firm's immediate environment. So 5 forces in place and the competitive intensity being high when environment is described as hostile. An environmental complexity which reflects the variety in the business environment in contrast to simple business environments. For instance, commodity food products manufactured to local markets in contrast to global market where the firm is manufacturing rapidly technology products which are rapidly changing and where the customer demand is constantly changing. Let's say top tier mobile phones where you have the new models coming in many times a year, for instance, or like Apple bringing in one new mobile phone per year to the market. So it means it means that the environment is dynamic and complex, but also in that sense also uh, relatively hostile. This is not to say that those concepts would be the only ones used to describe the business environments, but they provide some examples how the business environment can be understood. So then we need a structured tool to understand how we could describe um, the different possible futures, and scenarios is a tool to do this. So we use scenarios to describe the different typologies of business environments, different types of possible futures in the world, in our business environment, to compare them and to describe, to illustrate the variety. Some use a structured, systematic way to illustrate the variety. Define the scope and time. So we have four phases. First, define the scope, time frame, and stakeholders. So we define the scope in terms of products, markets, and technologies, and the time scope, perhaps 10, depending on the industry, depending on the firm needs, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 5 years. I used 10 years there as a suggestion, as a, let's say, typical example. And then to identify the stakeholders to whom the scenarios are for. So who are the decision makers to whom the scenarios are being developed for? At the second stage, we identify the basic trends and uncertainties. So we use, for instance, PESTEL as a checklist, as a simple tool to understand um, the, the, the components of the environmental changes. So we use PESTEL as a checklist. We try to cluster the trends, the components, the trends which are reflecting our environment, describing our environment, um, and perhaps trying to understand the causalities between the different trends, for instance, how the digitalization is impacting on customer needs, and how the changes in customer needs are then changing the product or service landscape and business models, etc. We construct scenario themes. You can have a variety of number of scenario themes. Let's say that we would construct 3 scenario themes, for instance, from the food industry being the meat dream, tame tale, and vegetarian heaven. We describe the 3 different scenarios by table, for instance, or by some picture. We try to word and explain what we mean by the different scenarios and make sure that all of the scenarios that we use are relevant and plausible. And we discuss, interact, develop those scenarios so that we are satisfied that those are the scenarios that cover the different variables, for instance, from the PESTEL that we just did, and then that the scenarios are truly describing relevant combinations of variables, remembering that those scenarios shouldn't be just about varieties of one single variable, but actually typologies, combinations of different variables, plausible components of combinations of different variables. And then finally, we generate a narrative comparing the or considering that how the scenarios will impact to our company scenario. And the narrative here means that we create a narrative that describes the scenarios. So why scenarios? Let's go a little bit more detailed through the process. They help the company to define the different possible futures, to see the needs for strategic adaptation, to describe what's happening in the business environment, in the broader society, describe generically different futures rather than variation in only one variable, in only one theme, let's say digitalization. Identify relevant factors for change, identify the possible varying scenarios, and feed data to the decision making, as already said. We have here the structural drivers of environmental change, so-called PESTEL variables. So these describe the different components of PESTEL, meaning political, economical, sociocultural, technological, ecological, and legal dimensions. Then giving away some examples in a form of checklists, for instance, how different technologies are changing in our business environment. Digitalization, new digital innovations, speed of technological change, new innovations, new products or service or solution innovations, and also consumer attitudes towards innovations. In terms of political landscape, R&D investments, if something significant is happening. For instance, if some countries are more heavily intending to invest to certain technological developments, which would impact on the technological cycles and developments. Political dimensions, government, stability of the political systems, governments, changes in tax policies, changes in trade regulations, or welfare politics might influence in some specific industries like social and healthcare, for instance, but many others, of course. Economics, the trade cycles, cross-domestic product trends, GDP trends, interest rates, inflation, unemployment, and general wealth in the nation. Sociocultural dimensions, population structure, spread of income, social mobility, lifestyle changes. If we're looking at 10 years forward, the changes can be quite drastic. So even in cases where these changes may seem relatively large, they may be particularly relevant in the coming 10 years. So that's why it's important to consider also those factors that at the moment may seem somewhat distant. Let's say the impact of digitalization on universities, for instance. What is the role of virtual learning, distant learning in 10, 15 years when we have fully virtual systems in different Western economic, in different home. Well, let's say that every person, every home in Western societies have virtual systems in place within the next 10 years, so that virtual reality is fully existent in 10 years time. Obviously at the moment already we are effectively using Zoom, and this change has happened rapidly, but it's moving forward, and how that influences on universities and the competitive landscape of universities in the future, of course, is quite drastic. Neglecting this digitalization trend would be a drastic error for any university. So this is just one example, but these types of issues. So how these components, these drivers of environmental change influence on the firm, and what type of potential futures result from these changes. So when we have the varieties of changes in our environment, how can we group the trends into these types of groups of components? Here we have, for instance, passenger car markets, where in this example, authors have identified certain significant trends such as urbanization, shifting lifestyles, evolving market characteristics and globalization, patterns of growth in emerging markets, environmental impacts and actions. How can we group these trends? Some trends may be more relevant sooner, some are more relevant later, some are less likely, some are more likely. But let's say that we would have university and the digitalization as one. We have many other changes, which are how the digitalization is impacting on consumer behaviors. Globalization, how digitalization is enabling the globalization of university education, and how is that influencing, etc. So many types of trends taking place at the same time. So we define the scope, time frame as stakeholders, as said and explained. Company, products, market, technologies, the time frame 5 to 15 years, for instance, and then for whom the scenarios are being developed. When we are developing, when we identify the trends, when we are developing the scenarios, we try to understand the causalities behind these trends. This is an example from Wärtsilä's scenario development. If I just now continue with the university example that I started, digitalization is changing consumer behavior. We have the trend in terms of sustainability, which is influencing on lifestyles. It may be influencing on traveling, and all that may be contributing to distance learning, remote learning usage among the students, etc. So there are many types of causalities influencing and generating the scenarios, and this is important to identify when crafting the scenarios. So notify the different trends, and then the causes and effects between the trends. You construct the scenario themes. Here, Wärtsilä crafted 3 scenario themes based on the trend analysis: rough seas, yellow river, and open oceans. So these were the 3 scenarios that they developed, the different possible futures that they identified. The rough seas, which would mean scarcity of resources becoming predominant, climate change adding further stress, bilateral agreements and cartels overtaken free markets, and wealth being divided very unequally among nations, resulting to global tensions between nations. Yellow River, the position of China being very dominant in the global arena, resource-intensive manufacturing moving to Africa and other Asian countries, economic growth being significantly lower in the West, in the Western world, and climate change being tackled only on a regional level, no global agreements exist. And then the open oceans, the global megacorporations and megacities gaining power over the nation states, governments cooperating on the governance of climate issues and free trade protocols, climate change being perceived as an opportunity and innovating green solutions as part of the lifestyle. So open oceans, yellow river, and rough seas as three possible scenarios, the three different possible future states and scenarios developed in Wärtsilä. So basically, in this lecture, we went through how to develop scenarios. In order to generate the narrative for each scenario. So consider that the different scenarios are the descriptions of different possible future states. Then you finally generate or create a narrative to describe the scenario. So you can have a story to describe each scenario, or you can just use the table as in the previous slide or one figure to illustrate. But it's important to remember that there is this logic, this narrative behind each scenario, plausible scenario. So what we were doing in this lecture, what is the point of this lecture, is to understand the macro environment. You have the macro, you have the meso, and you have the internal, the firm, the micro. Macro versus the micro versus the macro in between the meso. So you have the internal firm, you have the ecosystem, the value system layer, and then you have the broader macro environment. We went through the different concepts to understand the macro environment, dynamism, complexity, and hostility. We talked about the contingency perspective, which emphasizes the strategic fit between the business environment, firm strategy, and the value system organization. And then we described the scenarios as a tool from defining the scope, moving to defining the possible futures, using the pestle to understand the macro environment, and then moving to defining the possible futures by using scenarios, defining three different scenarios as combinations of different components, and then finally describing the scenarios by using narratives. So this is an important tool and vehicle to understand the business environment, and a short explanation in this lecture. My name is Prof Kohtamäki. Thank you for listening, and hopefully this helps a bit in terms of understanding the business environment of the firm. Thank you.